The autumn rain had just stopped when they came, the cobblestones of Paris still gleaming wet under the weak November sun of 1917. And Marie Dubois heard them before she saw them, the rhythmic thud of boots on stone, hundreds of them moving in unison, a sound that had become as familiar to the city as the morning bells of Notre Dame. She was carrying bread from the bakery, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, when she heard something else beneath the marching, voices singing in English, deep and resonant, carrying a melody she'd never heard before. The sound made her stop on the Rue de Rivoli, one hand clutching her basket, the other shielding her eyes as she looked toward the sound. They rounded the corner in formation, and the bread nearly fell from Marie's hands. American soldiers. That much was clear from the uniforms, but not like the white doughboys she'd seen lounging outside cafes near the Gare du Nord. The ones who stumbled through broken French and tipped too heavily when drunk on cheap wine. These soldiers wore French helmets, the Adrian with its crest catching the light, and they carried French rifles, the Lebel and Berthier she recognized from her brother's regiment. But their faces were dark, brown, and black, and they marched with a precision that made the street fall silent. An old man beside her, a veteran of 1870 with one arm missing, muttered something under his breath. Les soldats noirs, he said. The black soldiers. But his tone carried no malice, only wonder. More Parisians were stopping now, emerging from shops and doorways, some pointing, others simply staring. A group of schoolchildren pressed against their teacher, their mouths forming perfect O's of surprise. Marie saw a woman in an expensive coat lean toward her companion and whisper something that made them both crane their necks for a better view. The soldiers kept marching, their faces forward, disciplined and proud, though Marie caught glimpses of eyes flickering toward the crowds, perhaps searching for welcome or hostility, perhaps just taking in the impossibility of Paris, this city of light and stone and history that many of them, she would later learn, had never imagined they would see. At the front of the column rode an officer, also black, his uniform pressed and proper, and behind the marching troops came something that made the silence break into scattered applause and gasps, a military band. When they began to play, the music that poured into the Paris afternoon was like nothing Marie had ever heard. It wasn't a march, not exactly, though it had that driving rhythm. It was syncopated, wild, and controlled at once, the horns wailing and moaning in a way that seemed to tell a story without words. Jazz, she would learn it was called, though the word meant nothing to her then. What mattered was how it made her feel, as if something locked inside her chest had suddenly opened, as if the war and the rain and the endless gray grief of the past 3 years had been pierced by something vital and alive. The soldiers disappeared down the boulevard toward their barracks, but the music lingered, and so did the questions. That night in the cafe where Marie sometimes took her evening coffee, the talk was of nothing else. Americans, they say, said Monsieur Petit, who ran the tobacco shop, but fighting for the French because their own army won't let them fight. He shook his head, mystified. What kind of army does this? I heard they came from Harlem, said another patron, a young woman who worked at the newspaper. It's a neighborhood in New York where the colored people live. The 369th Infantry Regiment, they're calling them the Harlem Hellfighters. Hellfighters, someone repeated, testing the word. Will they fight, though? Or just parade? The answer came in blood and fire on the Western Front in the trenches of Champagne in the Argonne Forest, where the 369th Infantry Regiment and other black American units were sent to fight under French command because General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, refused to let them serve alongside white American troops. The French, desperate for men after years of slaughter, welcomed them. French officers, accustomed to leading Senegalese and Moroccan troops from France's colonial empire, took command of these American soldiers who spoke no French but fought with a determination that stunned everyone who witnessed it. Lieutenant Jacques Moreau first met his new American troops on a cold morning in December when they arrived at the sector his regiment was defending north of Verdun. He had fought since 1914, survived the Marne and the hell of Fort Douaumont, and he prided himself on being beyond surprise. But when he saw these men, tall, strong, many of them young, their dark faces serious under their French helmets, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Boone Vonway, he said, extending his hand to the first sergeant, a man named William from Georgia who gripped his hand with a firmness that said more than words could. Through interpreters and gestures and the universal language of soldiers, Moreau came to understand the bitter irony of their situation. These men had volunteered to fight for democracy, to make the world safe for freedom, but in their own country they couldn't vote in many states, couldn't sit in the same train cars as whites, couldn't drink from the same water fountains. They'd been assigned to labor battalions at first and loading ships, digging latrines, building roads, while white soldiers were given rifles and sent to fight. Only when the French agreed to take them had they been allowed to become combat soldiers. They want to prove themselves, the interpreter told Moreau. They want to show they can fight. Then we will let them fight, Moreau said simply. And we will see. What he saw in the weeks and months that followed changed him. The black American soldiers fought with a courage born of something more than duty. They fought as if every bullet fired, every yard of trench held, was a refutation of everything they'd been told about themselves. They fought through gas attacks and artillery barrages that turned the earth into a moonscape of craters and corpses. They fought in the freezing mud of winter and the choking dust of summer. And they died just as French soldiers died, just as all soldiers died in that war. Their blood mixing in the churned earth without regard for color or nation. On a night in May 1918, in a listening post in no man's land, Private Henry Johnson from Albany, New York, and Private Needham Roberts from Trenton, New Jersey, were on guard duty when the Germans attacked. Johnson, small and wiry, barely tall enough to meet the Army's height requirement, had worked as a railroad porter before the war, a job where he'd learned to smile and bow and endure casual contempt with quiet dignity. But in that darkness, with Roberts wounded and Germans pouring through the wire, something in Johnson snapped open like a blade. He fired his rifle until it jammed, then fought with his knife and the butt of his gun, and finally with a bolo knife he'd acquired somewhere, slashing and stabbing with a fury that drove back the German raiders and saved Roberts' life. When dawn came and French and American officers surveyed the scene, German bodies scattered, blood everywhere, Johnson wounded a dozen times but still alive, the story began to spread. The French awarded Johnson the Croix de Guerre with a gold palm, the first American soldier to receive France's highest military honor. When news reached Paris, the newspapers seized on it. Le Courage Noir wrote one headline, "The Black Courage." The articles described his heroism in terms that would have been impossible in American papers, which either ignored the story or buried it in back pages. French journalists wrote of Johnson as they would write of any hero, without qualification or condescension, and when he was brought to Paris to recover from his wounds, people stopped him on the street to shake his hand. Women smiled at him. Children asked for his autograph. Old soldiers offered him drinks in cafes where, just months before, he might have been refused service in his own country. "It's like a dream," Johnson told another soldier from his regiment, a man named James from Chicago. They were sitting in a small restaurant near Montmartre, eating beef stew and drinking red wine that the owner had poured without asking for payment, insisting it was for heroes. "I keep thinking I'll wake up back in Albany or back in that trench, and this won't be real." James, who had been a teacher before the war, nodded slowly. "It's real," he said. "But it's also not America, remember that. This isn't ours to keep." Yet for a few shining months it felt like it might be. More black American troops poured into France throughout 1918, the 370th, 371st, and 372nd Infantry Regiments, tens of thousands of men who had been dismissed as inferior by their own military establishment. They fought at Belleauwood and Chateau Thierry in the Second Battle of the Marne and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. They suffered casualty rates as high or higher than white units, and they earned hundreds of French medals for valor. The 369th Infantry Regiment served 191 consecutive days in combat, longer than any other American unit in the war, and never lost a trench or had a man captured. French officers wrote home about their bravery, and French soldiers fought beside them with a camaraderie that transcended language. In Paris, the presence of black American soldiers became part of the fabric of wartime life. Marie Dubois saw them often now in the parks and the museums, lining up outside theaters, gathered around street musicians, always in groups, always watchful but increasingly at ease. She began to recognize some of them, including a tall, quiet man who came into the stationery shop where she worked part-time. His name was Thomas, he told her in halting French, and he was from Mississippi. He bought postcards to send home, writing careful messages on each one. When she asked what he wrote about, he looked up with eyes that held something she couldn't quite name, joy and sorrow mixed together. "I tell them about the city," he said. "I tell them about the buildings and the lights. I tell them French people treat us like men." He paused, his pencil hovering over a card showing the Eiffel Tower. "I don't tell them how hard it's going to be to go back." Marie didn't understand at first. "But you'll be heroes," she said. "You fought for your country." Thomas smiled, and it was the saddest smile she'd ever seen. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you don't know my country." But even he couldn't fully resist the magic of those days. When the 369th Regimental Band, led by Lieutenant James Reese Europe, played at the Theatre des Champs-Élysées, the event became legendary. Europe, a bandleader from Harlem who had brought some of the best black musicians in America to France, understood that music could say what words could not. His band played Sousa marshes and French patriotic songs, but they also played jazz, that strange, syncopated music from the brothels and dance halls of New Orleans and New York. music that had never been heard in Europe's grand concert halls. The audience, packed with French soldiers on leave and Parisian society, sat stunned at first, then erupted in applause that shook the chandeliers. They demanded encore after encore. Women wept. Men cheered. And in the balcony, a group of black soldiers from the 369th watched with tears streaming down their faces as French people white. People celebrated something that had been born in their own neighborhoods, their own churches and clubs, something that America had dismissed as primitive and vulgar. "They see us," whispered one soldier to another. "They really see us." But not everyone saw them with admiration. Colonel Alan Greer, a white American liaison officer, watched the French embrace black troops with growing alarm. He had been raised in South Carolina, steeped in the racial hierarchies of the American South, and the sight of black soldiers being treated as equals, being praised, decorated, welcomed into cafes and homes, violated everything he believed about the natural order of things. In August 1918, he composed a document titled Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops, a memorandum addressed to French military officers and civilian officials. The document, written in French, was a masterpiece of racist propaganda disguised as helpful advice. "We must prevent the rise of any pronounced degree of intimacy between French officers and black officers," it stated. "We may be courteous and amiable with these last, but we cannot deal with them on the same plane as with the white American officer without deeply wounding the latter. We must not eat with them, must not shake hands or seek to talk or meet with them outside of the requirements of military service." The document went on to warn against spoiling the Negroes, against treating them with the kind of respect and equality that might give them dangerous ideas. White Americans, it explained with chilling clarity, become greatly incensed at any public expression of intimacy between white women and black men. Some French officers, out of politeness or political calculation, received the memo without comment. Others were disgusted. One captain wrote in his diary, "How can they ask us to treat men who fight and die beside us as if they are something less than human? This is madness." The memo was leaked to French newspapers, causing a minor scandal, but the damage was done, the document revealed. In stark bureaucratic language, the depths of American racial hatred and the government's determination to export it to Europe. Yet the French people, on the whole, resisted these efforts. Part of it was practical. France had long employed colonial troops from Africa, and while colonial attitudes carried their own forms of racism and condescension, there was no legal segregation, no lynching, no systematic terror of the kind that ruled the American South. Black American soldiers represented something different to French civilians. They were exotic but also familiar, foreign but also allied, and their presence offered a glimpse into a place America that seemed both magnificent and monstrous in its contradictions. In the village of Romany-sous-Montfaucon, where elements of the 369th rested after the final offensive, an old woman named Madame Lefebvre invited 3 black soldiers into her home for dinner. Her son had been killed at Verdun, and her husband in 1914, and she lived alone in a stone house that still bore shrapnel scars. The soldiers, Samuel, Robert, and William, sat awkwardly at her table, overwhelmed by her hospitality. She served them soup and bread and poured wine, and through a mix of gestures and broken language they talked. She showed them a photograph of her son in his uniform, and they showed her photographs from home families, churches, streets that looked nothing like France. "You are far from home," she said, and they nodded. "So was my son. He never came back." "We're sorry," Samuel said, and she waved the apology away. "You fight for France," she said firmly. "You are welcome here, always." It was a small moment in a small village, but it was repeated in thousands of variations across France. In Paris, black soldiers danced with French women in the clubs of Montmartre, relationships that would have been illegal in many American states and could provoke lethal violence. In Marseille, they were cheered in the streets. In Lyon, they were invited to family dinners. The French were not free of racism. They had their own colonial attitudes, their own hierarchies, but they did not have Jim Crow, did not have the systematic dehumanization that defined black life in America. For black soldiers, it was a revelation and a torment, the revelation of being treated as fully human, the torment of knowing it would end. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, Paris exploded in joy. Church bells rang, people poured into the streets, strangers embraced and wept. Black American soldiers joined the celebrations, marching through the city they had helped defend, and Parisians threw flowers and cheered and pressed wine bottles into their hands. Marie Dubois, standing in the crowd on the Champs-Élysées, watched the 369th march past in their worn French uniforms, their colors flying, their faces showing exhaustion and pride in something else, a shadow of knowledge about what came next. In the months after the armistice, as demobilization slowly began, black soldiers remained in France, occupying towns in the Rhineland, performing guard duty, waiting for ships to take them home. They spent their leave time in Paris, cramming into clubs and theaters, buying souvenirs, taking photographs beside the Seine in the Arc de Triomphe. They knew these were their last days of freedom. American newspapers had begun reporting on the problem of black soldiers who had gotten uppity in France, who had forgotten their place. Lynchings were increasing back home, and white mobs were attacking black neighborhoods with impunity. The Red Summer of 1919 was coming. Though they didn't know it by that name, yet all they knew was that danger waited for them in the country they had fought to defend. Lieutenant Moreau came to Paris in January 1919 to see his American soldiers before they shipped out. He found a group of them in a café near the Gare de l'Est, drinking coffee and talking quietly. Thomas from Mississippi was there, and Henry Johnson, recovered from his wounds but walking with a permanent limp. They stood when Moreau entered, old habits of military courtesy, but he waved them down and pulled up a chair. "I want to tell you something," Moreau said through an interpreter. "I have fought with many soldiers, French, British, Senegalese, Moroccan. You are among the best I have ever known, not because you are black or American or anything else, just because you are good soldiers, brave soldiers." He paused, struggling with emotion. "France will not forget what you did for us. I will not forget." Thomas spoke for the group, his voice quiet. "We won't forget France, sir. We won't forget what it felt like to be men here." Moreau left the café with tears in his eyes, and he wasn't alone. All across Paris, French civilians who had befriended black American soldiers came to say goodbye, pressing gifts into their hands, writing addresses and promising to write letters, embracing them in public in ways that would have been unthinkable in America. Women wept. Old soldiers saluted. Children waved. And the black soldiers, these men who had fought for democracy and freedom, boarded ships that would take them back to a country where they could be lynched for looking at a white woman, where they would march in victory parades and then be told to use the back door, where the medals they wore would make them targets rather than heroes. When the 369th Infantry Regiment marched through Harlem in February 1919, 1 million people lined the streets. It was a triumph, a validation, a moment of pure joy, and also a beginning. These men had seen what it was like to be treated as equal. They had fought and bled and been decorated by a foreign nation that valued their courage. They had walked the streets of Paris as men, not as a subclass defined by skin color. And they brought that knowledge home with them, that dangerous, powerful knowledge that things could be different. Marie Dubois never forgot the day she first saw them marching through Paris. Those black soldiers in French helmets singing in a language she didn't understand. Years later, after another war had devastated France, after jazz had become the soundtrack of liberation and American culture had flooded Europe, she would tell her grandchildren about those soldiers. "They came to fight for us," she would say, "but their own country didn't want them. Can you imagine? They saved the world and went home to hatred." She kept a photograph, faded and creased, that showed the 369th marching past the Arc de Triomphe. They were heroes, she would insist. And France knew it, even if America didn't. The meetings between black American soldiers and French civilians in 1917 and 19 were brief, constrained by war and language and the vast machinery of military bureaucracy. Yet they mattered. They planted seeds in the minds of black soldiers, who would become activists and artists and leaders of the civil rights movement, in the minds of French people who would later resist Nazi occupation with some of the same courage these Americans had shown, in the cultural exchange that brought jazz and black American literature to Europe and made Paris a haven for black artists in the decades to come. When James Baldwin and Richard Wright and Josephine Baker fled America for France in the mid-20th century, they were following a path first walked by those soldiers in French helmets, those men who discovered that dignity was possible, that respect was real, that the America they knew was not the only America that could exist. But the immediate aftermath was bitter. The soldiers of the 369th and other black regiments returned to an America convulsed by racial violence. The Red Summer of 1919 saw race riots in dozens of cities, with white mobs attacking, black neighborhoods and black veterans fighting back with the weapons and training the army had given them. Henry Johnson, the hero of France, couldn't find steady work and died in poverty in 1929, his medals locked in a drawer. The army denied him the American Medal of Honor he deserved. That wouldn't come until 2015, long after his death. James Reese Europe, the band leader who had introduced jazz to France, was murdered in 1919 by one of his own drummers in a dispute over music. The dream they had glimpsed in Paris of being treated as fully human, as citizens, as men receded into memory, a painful reminder of what could be but wasn't. Yet the memory persisted, stubborn and vital as life itself. The soldiers told their children and grandchildren about Paris, about the French people who had welcomed them, about the medals and the music and the brief, shining moment when they had been seen for who they truly were. Those children would grow up to challenge Jim Crow, to march and sit in and organize, to demand the rights their fathers and grandfathers had fought for overseas. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of a dream, when activists invoked the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while denying it at home, they were drawing on a legacy that began in the trenches of France, in the streets of Paris, in the moment when black soldiers and French civilians met and recognized each other's humanity across barriers of language and culture and history. The French, too, remembered. After World War II, when American forces again arrived in France, there were questions about racial segregation in the American military. The French had not forgotten the black soldiers of 1918, had not forgotten their courage or the cruel irony of their treatment. And gradually, slowly, the story began to be told more fully in memoirs and histories, in documentaries and monuments, in the French government's decision to honor the 369th Infantry Regiment and other black American units with citations and commemorations. In 1994, France issued a postage stamp honoring the Buffalo Soldiers, acknowledging a debt that had gone unpaid for too long. The streets of Paris where Marie Dubois first saw them march are still there. The cobblestones replaced, but the route the same, and on November 11th of each year, when France commemorates the armistice, some of the wreaths laid bare the colors of the 369th Infantry Regiment. A few historians and descendants make the pilgrimage, standing in the places where black soldiers from Harlem and Chicago and Mississippi walked with their heads held high, if only for a moment, if only in a foreign land. They were far from home, but they were home in a way they had never been before, and that paradox, that bitter gift of grace, changed everything. What France said when they first saw black American soldiers in Paris during World War I was not one thing, but many things: surprise, curiosity, admiration, respect, solidarity, and ultimately recognition. The simple, powerful recognition that these men were soldiers, were heroes, were human in the fullest sense of the word. That recognition came easily to many French people in a way it could not come to white Americans. Not then, perhaps not for a long time afterward. It was not perfect. Colonial attitudes and racial assumptions existed in France as everywhere, but it was real enough to matter, real enough to give men like Henry Johnson and Thomas and James and hundreds of thousands of others a glimpse of what their lives could be like in a world without Jim Crow, without lynching, without the daily humiliations of American racial caste. And perhaps what matters most is not what France said, but what those soldiers heard in that saying, a message that they carried home in their bones and blood, a message that said, "You are worthy, you are brave, you are men." It was a message many of them had never heard before, and having heard it once, they could never fully forget it. They could never go back to accepting what they had accepted before, could never quite believe the lies they had been told about themselves. France, without meaning to, without fully understanding what it was doing, had helped light a fire that would burn through decades, through generations, until the country those soldiers fought for became, slowly and painfully and incompletely, something closer to the country they deserved. On a rainy afternoon in March 1919, just before the last of the 369th departed for America, a French officer stood at attention as the troop train pulled away from the station. He saluted, holding the gesture long after the train disappeared from view, and only then did he lower his hand and turn away. A journalist who witnessed the scene asked him why he had saluted so long, and the officer's answer was simple: because they earned it, because they gave us everything and we gave them so little in return, because when they needed an army that would treat them as soldiers, France said yes when their own country said no. He paused, watching the empty tracks. And because I will never see their like again, and I wanted to remember, Marie Dubois, who had seen them arrive and now saw them leave, stood at the same station with a handkerchief pressed to her face, and she was crying, crying for the war that had taken so much, crying for the strange justice and injustice of it all, crying for these men who had saved her city and her country and would go home to a place that did not see them as she saw them. She had given one of them, Thomas from Mississippi, a small tricolor ribbon as a keepsake, and he had pressed it to his lips before putting it carefully in his pocket. "I'll keep it," he told her. "I'll keep it to remember this was real." It was real. The marching through Paris streets, the medals awarded in blood, the jazz echoing in concert halls, the quiet conversations in cafes, the recognition in the eyes of strangers, all of it was real. And though the world they returned to tried to deny it, tried to push them back into the places assigned to them, the memory remained. What France said when they first saw black American soldiers in Paris was, in the end, the truth, that courage has no color, that honor belongs to those who earn it, that every man who fights and bleeds deserves dignity. It was a simple truth, obvious to anyone not blinded by hate, but in 1917 it was revolutionary. And in the hearts of the men who heard it, in the lives of the generations they shaped, that revolution never ended. It burns still, a fire lit in the streets of Paris by men in French helmets who fought for a dream and glimpsed it briefly, on foreign soil men who came home changed and changing, carrying France's message in their souls. You are worthy. You are brave. You are free.